My name is Claire Morrison, and I'm 31 years old. Until recently, I thought I understood what betrayal looked like. I believed it wore a stranger's face, someone outside your circle, someone without access to your heart. I never imagined it would wear my mother's smile or carry the same last name as mine. What happened to me didn't happen suddenly. That's what makes it worse. It unfolded quietly, methodically, under the illusion of normalcy. But the moment I stepped onto the steps of the church, bouquet in hand, something in me shifted. I froze. The weight of something invisible pressed down on my chest. There was no chaos, no screaming, just a stillness so absolute, I felt like I had entered a different life. I saw the guests already seated inside. I recognized their faces, family, friends, co-workers. They looked peaceful, unaware. Some were even smiling, their heads tilted as if admiring a bride. But I was still outside. And then I saw her, walking down the aisle in the dress I had chosen 6 months earlier, the veil I had cried over in the boutique mirror, the shoes I had custom ordered from a small designer in Seattle. All of it, mine. Except she was wearing it, my sister, and standing between me and that reality was my mother. She didn't say a word, didn't move. Her presence alone told me exactly what I needed to know. I wasn't the bride. Not anymore. I had been erased. If you've ever felt your world collapse in slow motion, if someone close to you once made you feel like you didn't matter in a moment when everything should have, I want to hear from you. Comment below where you're watching from, like this video, subscribe to this channel, and let me know you're out there. You're not alone. I'm telling my story not just to be heard, but to create space for those who've endured the unthinkable and survived it. Because surviving it, that's where my story truly begins. That moment at the church door wasn't the beginning. It was the eruption, the earthquake after months of silent tremors. But to understand how I got there, how a woman like me could be blindsided on what was supposed to be the most sacred day of her life, you'd have to know what came before. You'd have to understand what it was like growing up as the oldest daughter in a house where love was conditional and attention came with competition. From the outside, we looked like a close-knit family. My parents were active in the community. We went to church every Sunday. We had family photos taken every Christmas, color-coordinated and full of polished smiles. But under the surface, there was a current that always pulled in one direction, toward my younger sister, Emily. Emily was the favorite, though no one would dare say it out loud. She had a way of commanding the room with little effort. Where I was quiet, she was radiant. Where I was careful, she was reckless. But it was always called passion when she did it. She cried often and loudly, and the world always moved to soothe her. I learned young that being the strong one meant being the silent one, that my job was to understand, to sacrifice, to step aside. I did it so well that I didn't even realize how early I disappeared. Even in adulthood, the pattern held. I graduated with honors, built a stable career in urban development, and bought my first apartment at 28. But my accomplishments were met with polite applause. When Emily posted a photo from a yoga retreat or changed her hair color, my mother's voice sparkled with delight. "She's just so brave," she would say. Brave because she lived without a plan. Brave because she relied on others to carry her when she couldn't carry herself. When I met Daniel, I thought for once I had something entirely mine. He was calm, intelligent, deeply respectful. He listened. He made me laugh. He didn't interrupt when I spoke. We built a relationship slowly, thoughtfully. When he proposed, I said yes with a confidence I hadn't felt in years. I thought he saw me, really saw me. I should have known better, or at least I should have paid attention to the way the atmosphere shifted when I brought him home to meet my family. Emily was sweet to his face, but distant when I looked away. My mother barely asked me about the engagement, but quizzed Daniel on his career and background with enthusiastic approval. And slowly, the same cold wind I had known as a girl crept back in. Little things started going wrong during the wedding planning. Vendors not responding. Dates changed without my approval. My mother refused to come dress shopping. Emily declined her role as maid of honor with a vague excuse. Daniel, always so attentive, became harder to reach. "Work is just intense right now," he told me. "Sorry I missed your call." But I kept going, because that's what I was trained to do: persist, smile, fix things on my own. I convinced myself it was wedding stress. I convinced myself I was being too sensitive. I convinced myself they all loved me in their own way. Until I stood in front of that church, my name absent from the program, my face absent from the photos, and my heart hollow from the realization that I hadn't been included in the most defining moment of my own life. Not just excluded, replaced. And now, I had a choice: to crumble under the weight of their betrayal, or to rise from it and begin again. This is my story, and I'm ready to tell it. They say the oldest child often becomes the default caretaker, the dependable one, the one who makes things easier for everyone else. I used to think that was a compliment, that being quiet, responsible, and composed meant I was doing things right. But looking back, I realize it was just the beginning of my invisibility. I was 6 years old the first time I noticed it. Noticed that when Emily cried, the world stopped. My mother's footsteps would thunder down the hall, her arms opening wide like some sort of sanctuary. My father's stern face would melt instantly as he scooped Emily up, soothing her with promises and treats. I had cried too, before, but somewhere along the line, I must have stopped. It didn't seem to earn me the same reaction, so I learned how to be good. I cleaned up my own messes. I brushed my hair without being told. I said please and thank you and didn't complain when Emily got the last cookie or when she threw a tantrum in the middle of dinner. I told myself that being the older sister meant knowing better. That sacrifice was just part of love. I became a master of swallowing disappointment. As we grew up, the pattern deepened like well-worn grooves in a trail. Emily, only 2 years younger than me, somehow always demanded more. More space, more attention, more forgiveness. Her mistakes were explained away as creative expression or just a phase, while my successes were met with muted approval. When I brought home straight A's, my parents nodded. When Emily passed a class she had nearly failed, we went out for dinner. She had a gift for drawing people in. Teachers adored her. Friends gathered around her like moths to light. She was beautiful. There was no denying that. Blonde hair that curled naturally, big blue eyes that welled with tears at exactly the right moment. I had darker features, sharper edges, and a personality that people described as mature even when I was 10. It wasn't meant as an insult, but it felt like one. Mature meant predictable. It meant boring. It meant invisible. By middle school, I had stopped trying to compete. I focused on academics, on art, on getting into a good high school. I built a world where no one could take anything from me because no one else seemed interested in what I was building. Emily floated through life, suspended by the grace of everyone's lowered expectations. When she forgot a project or skipped a practice, someone always stepped in to rescue her. When I worked hard for something, it was expected, rarely celebrated. My mother and I were never close. There were no late-night talks, no mother-daughter shopping trips. When I got my period, she handed me a pack of pads and told me to read the instructions. When I was dumped for the first time at 17, she told me I was too emotional. But when Emily failed her driver's test and cried for an hour, my mother took her for ice cream and promised to pay for extra lessons. My father was gentler but passive. He didn't challenge my mother's choices. He didn't question her favoritism. When I tried to talk to him about the way I felt, he'd say things like, "You know your mother means well," or "That's just how sisters are." But it wasn't how we were. It was how we had been shaped, and I was always the one expected to bend. In college, I finally experienced what it was like to be seen. I attended a university a few hours away from home, majoring in urban development. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me purpose. For the first time, my life was mine. I made friends who admired my discipline, professors who encouraged my ideas. I wasn't competing for space, I had it. Emily, meanwhile, was drifting through her second or third major at a state school closer to home. She bounced between relationships and jobs, calling home often, pulling my mother's attention back to her like a magnet. I didn't mind. Not really. I had built enough of a foundation that I didn't need their applause anymore, but I still wanted their presence. I graduated with honors, moved into my first apartment, and took a position at a local planning firm. I called home to share the news, but no one answered. Later, my mother sent a brief text. "Good for you. Emily had a panic attack today. I'll call when things calm down." Things never calmed down. Not when Emily was around. She burned through money, wrecked a car, fell in and out of toxic relationships. And every time, there was my mother, ready to pick up the pieces. I watched from a distance, unsure of whether I was lucky to be free of the chaos or wounded by my own emotional exile. When I met Daniel, I thought I had finally stepped into my own light. He was intelligent, calm, deliberate. He seemed to understand the way I measured my words, how I often paused before answering. He saw the care behind my quietness. For the first time, I felt safe. Not adored like Emily always had been, but respected. And that was better. My family responded with lukewarm politeness. Emily called him cute and asked too many questions. My mother didn't comment much at all, but I didn't care. I was building a life that didn't require their validation. I was creating something real. Our engagement felt like proof that I had done everything right. I had taken my time. I had chosen wisely. I had grown into someone who could be trusted, who could love and be loved in return. We set a date. We booked the church. We made plans. But then the silences returned. Subtle at first. My mother didn't offer to help with planning. Emily stopped responding to texts. Daniel seemed distracted during conversations. I brushed it off, told myself everyone was busy. I didn't realize I was becoming invisible again, and this time, it would cost me everything. The first time I truly questioned my place in Daniel's life, it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, so quiet it almost escaped me. But once the doubt settled in, it rooted deep, too deep to ignore. We were 3 months into our engagement when something shifted. I couldn't name it at first. It wasn't that Daniel had become unkind or withdrawn. He still responded to my messages, still kissed me goodbye, still asked how work was going. But his attention had thinned, like I was being viewed through a frosted window, familiar, but blurred. His enthusiasm, once effortless, became mechanical. His eyes didn't light up in conversations the way they used to. He started forgetting small details, things he used to remember before I even said them. I told myself it was stress. The wedding, his job, life, it was a lot. Everyone had their off days. Still, the weight in my chest grew heavier. Emily began showing up more. She never announced herself, but somehow she always seemed to be around. I would mention a venue or a vendor, and my mother would casually say that Emily had already looked into it. I'd ask about a weekend date to meet with the planner, only to learn that Emily had already spoken with her the day before. It felt like a dance I hadn't been invited to, yet everyone else knew the steps. At first, I tried to see it as help. Maybe they were just trying to take pressure off me. Maybe they meant well. But beneath the surface, something didn't sit right. My questions went unanswered. My suggestions were suddenly already handled. When I brought up concerns, They were dismissed as minor. The wedding was still mine, they said. But it didn't feel like it anymore. One afternoon, I came home early from work. Daniel's car was in the driveway, which was unusual for that time of day. I felt a flicker of excitement, thinking maybe he had taken the afternoon off for us to plan or rest. But when I walked in, the living room was empty and faint voices echoed from the kitchen. I paused in the hallway, my heart thudding for no reason I could justify. I heard laughter, his and Emily's. Low, familiar, intimate laughter. The kind I hadn't heard from him in weeks. I stepped into the room and they both looked up, startled but composed. Nothing seemed wrong, nothing was obviously out of place, but I felt like an intruder in my own home. They smiled too quickly. The conversation shifted too fast, and I couldn't unsee the comfort between them, the kind that doesn't happen overnight. After that, I started noticing everything. Emily would text him directly. She'd send links to restaurants or playlists or articles he'd then mention in passing as if they'd just come to him. She began speaking for him in group chats, answering on his behalf. At family dinners, she sat beside him while I ended up across the table. I'd watch them share side glances, subtle and almost imperceptible, except I saw them. I noticed because I had lived my whole life reading the space between people, decoding the moments when I was no longer central. Even when I was younger, I had known how to read a room. It was survival. When my mother's eyes narrowed, I stepped back. When Emily pouted, I learned to wait. When my father sighed, I swallowed my questions. I adapted. And now, I was adapting again, trying to fit into a role that seemed to shrink by the day. I wanted to confront someone. I wanted answers. But what would I say? That I felt like a stranger in my engagement? That my sister was too close to my fiancé? That the people closest to me were making plans without me? It all sounded so small when spoken aloud, so petty, so speculative. But inside, it was a storm. I began retreating in small ways, letting others take over decisions I had once been excited to make. Staying silent when Emily suggested something I hated, skipping calls to my mother, canceling a few dress appointments. No one noticed, or if they did, they didn't ask why. Daniel and I still shared a bed, still went through the motions, but there was a gap between us now, and I could feel it expanding like a crack in glass. Each day, it spread a little farther. I watched him pull away with the same passive grace I had learned as a girl. Quiet, steady, without confrontation. And I responded the only way I knew how, by pretending it didn't hurt. Because if I acknowledged the fracture, I would have to confront the reality that I was being phased out of my own future. And I wasn't ready for that yet. I wasn't ready to admit that the life I had worked so hard to build was starting to slip through my fingers. So I smiled. I nodded. I let the silence grow. And I hoped, foolishly, that I was wrong. Weddings are supposed to be full of questions. Which color palette feels most timeless? How many guests can we afford? Should we serve wine with dinner or just champagne for the toast? But none of my questions were being answered anymore. Not because I wasn't asking, but because no one was listening. The silence had grown thicker by then, not just from Daniel, but from everyone. My mother rarely picked up my calls. Emily, once overly involved, suddenly went days without responding. The planner I had hired texted me cryptically, asking if I still wanted to move forward with the new arrangement. I reread the message 3 times before realizing I had no idea what she meant. I hadn't made any new arrangements, at least not that I knew of. Something had shifted, and it had nothing to do with flowers or menus. I began to dread checking my email. Each new message felt like a door being quietly closed behind my back. I'd receive updates I hadn't requested, confirmations for appointments I hadn't scheduled, payments deducted for items I hadn't approved. Somehow my own wedding had taken on a life I didn't recognize, and no one seemed to think I needed to be part of the process. I started compiling everything: notes, screenshots, timelines. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, only that I needed to prove to myself I wasn't imagining it, that I hadn't simply lost control because I was overwhelmed or distracted. The patterns were there. Emily's name was showing up more frequently in correspondence. My mother's email address appeared in places where only mine should have been. Decisions were being made, and my absence wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. There's a particular kind of pain in realizing you're no longer central to your own story. I'd spent so much of my life fading into the background for the sake of peace that I hadn't noticed how easily I could be erased when that peace no longer required me. One day, I stopped by my parents' house unannounced. I hadn't done that in years. The lights were on, voices coming from the living room. As I approached, I caught a glimpse through the sheer curtains. Emily and my mother were seated on the floor, dress fabric spilling around them in gentle waves. My wedding dress. It had been boxed in my apartment. I hadn't even opened it yet, waiting for a quiet weekend to do the first try-on. But there it was, spread across my mother's carpet like a relic being prepared for display. Emily was laughing, holding the bodice to her chest. My mother smiled, adjusting the straps. I didn't knock. I didn't go inside. I stood there, rooted to the spot, a dull roar rising in my ears. My dress, my mother, my sister. A scene that should have belonged to me, but didn't. When I left, I drove for hours. No destination, just the blur of highways and radio static. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just sat with the weight of it. The knowledge that something irreversible had begun. That the people I trusted most were rewriting the script, and I wasn't being given a role. I tried to talk to Daniel that night. Or rather, I tried to gauge his expression when I brought up my concerns. But he didn't meet my eyes. He nodded through my sentences, distant, distracted. There was a softness to his avoidance, as if he were apologizing for something he hadn't yet admitted to. And in that silence, I felt the confirmation I had been dreading. He wasn't mine anymore. Maybe he never had been. After that, I stopped trying to plan. I let the phone calls go to voicemail. I skipped the next venue visit. I stopped opening emails after sunset. I was still showing up, still going through the motions, but I no longer believed I was the bride in any of this. I watched as Emily became more central. She was mentioned in group texts, tagged in posts about the wedding, even thanked publicly at a family dinner for helping so much behind the scenes. People stopped asking me how things were going. They asked her instead. And she answered effortlessly, like it was her name on the invitations. One night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hands on my stomach, wondering what would happen if I just walked away. If I packed a bag and left town for a week, would anyone even notice? Would anyone call? Would Daniel chase after me? Would my mother worry? Would Emily blink? I already knew the answer, but I didn't leave. Not yet. Because a small, naive part of me still hoped this was all a misunderstanding, that it would resolve itself, that someone would wake up and realize what they were doing, that Daniel would remember who I was, that my mother would remember what it meant to protect a daughter, that Emily would stop taking everything that was mine. But time passed, and no one woke up. I began to feel like a placeholder in my own life. The invitations had gone out. The dress had been altered, the venue was reserved, but none of it felt real. It felt like I was watching someone else prepare for a life I wasn't going to live, and everyone around me was applauding the performance. One morning, I woke up to a notification on my phone. A photo had been posted to my mother's profile. Emily standing beside Daniel, both laughing, holding champagne glasses at what looked like a tasting event. My name wasn't mentioned. The caption said, "Final details coming together perfectly. Final details." Perfectly. I stared at that photo for a long time, not because I didn't understand what it meant, but because I did. Because I knew, without question, that they weren't planning a wedding for me anymore. They were planning it for her. And the silence I'd tolerated for so long, it had become their cover, their camouflage, their weapon. What I didn't realize then, but would learn soon enough, was that silence was also going to be my power. Because what they had taken without asking, I was going to take back, not with screaming, not with accusations, but with something far more dangerous: clarity. The week before the wedding was when everything truly began to fracture, not just in theory, not in the vague discomfort I had grown used to carrying, but in ways I could no longer deny. It was the week that exposed what had been buried for months, maybe longer. And it came not with explosions, but with silences that echoed louder than anything else. Monday started with an empty inbox, no updates from the caterer, no final checklist from the planner, no call from the florist confirming delivery. Nothing. Just a stillness that felt off. Not quiet, but absent. I stared at my phone, refreshing out of habit, watching nothing arrive. My calendar remained filled with appointments I hadn't scheduled and meetings I hadn't agreed to, and yet none of them involved me. Daniel had been gone for 3 nights, not physically. His things were still in the closet, his toothbrush still lined up next to mine. But emotionally, he had checked out. He came home late, said little, left early. His presence had taken on a form of ghosthood, visible but unreachable. I'd stopped asking where he was going. I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer anymore. On Wednesday, I drove by the venue. It wasn't something I planned. I'd taken the longer route home out of instinct, passing by the chapel where we were supposed to say our vows. A small, historic church on a hill, with stone steps and stained glass windows that caught the afternoon light. I'd fallen in love with it the moment I saw it. How simple it was. How peaceful. It had felt like the one part of the wedding that belonged entirely to me. That afternoon, it was bustling. Cars in the lot, people moving in and out with clipboards and boxes, white fabric draped across the entryway, tables being carried inside, a truck unloading crates of wine. I slowed my car and pulled over a short distance away, out of sight. I watched for 15 minutes without stepping out. No one had told me about any rehearsal or early setup. The planner hadn't mentioned anything in our last exchange, and I hadn't received a schedule, but clearly something was happening. I left without making myself known. I wasn't sure who I would have been if I had walked up that hill. The bride, the outsider, the witness. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts weaving in and out of half-finished memories and questions I couldn't answer. I thought about how it had started, me and Daniel sitting on the floor of our apartment, surrounded by lists and ideas, laughing as we imagined the future. I thought about Emily, how she had inserted herself gently at first, offering suggestions, connecting with vendors, just helping. And then, somehow, she became the voice everyone answered to. Thursday brought a dress fitting I didn't attend, or rather, one I didn't know was happening until I saw a tagged photo online. Emily at a boutique mirror, wearing something suspiciously familiar. The angle didn't show the full gown, but I recognized the neckline, the shape, the delicate embroidery I had chosen. My dress, or at least what used to be mine. The caption read, "Final adjustments. Can't wait for the big day." Not a single comment mentioned my name. I closed my phone and stared at the wall for a long time. Everything felt slippery. Reality shifted so quickly beneath me that I stopped trusting my own instincts. I kept asking myself, had I missed something? Had I agreed to this without realizing it? Had I faded out so much that I'd given them permission to take over? The self-doubt gnawed at me in slow, methodical bites. By Friday, the weight of pretending had become unbearable. I sat on the floor of my living room, surrounded by the pieces of a wedding I was no longer part of. Boxes with my name on them, ribbons I had tied myself, a guest book I had hand-selected, still blank. It all looked foreign now, props from a performance I hadn't been invited to finish. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but who would I call? My mother? She was complicit. Daniel? He was silent. Emily? She had already taken everything. There was no one left. That afternoon, I received a text from a distant cousin asking what time the ceremony began. She was flying in from out of state and had heard conflicting information. I stared at the message, my chest tightening. Conflicting information? I pulled out the invitation and scanned it again. The date read Saturday, but I remembered a conversation weeks earlier. Daniel had mentioned a possible change, something about a scheduling conflict. I hadn't thought much of it. No one had followed up. But now, with the cousin's message and the flurry of activity at the venue, my stomach dropped. I checked my email. Nothing. No update, no announcement, no clarification. I messaged the planner. No response. I checked the venue's public calendar. The event listed for Saturday didn't include my name. Just a vague title. Private ceremony. Morrison family. My last name. But not my first. I opened my social media apps again and scrolled. Posts from extended family began appearing. Photos of people arriving in town, rehearsals, a dinner the night before. My mother posing beside Emily, both of them radiant. The caption read, "Tomorrow is the day." Tomorrow, not Saturday. Tomorrow. And I wasn't in a single photo. The realization hit hard and cold. They had changed the date, or maybe they had never intended for me to be part of it at all. I stood up and looked around the room, the weight of clarity finally landing. It wasn't confusion anymore. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't bad communication. It was betrayal. The kind you can't undo. The kind that rewrites everything you thought you knew. The kind that teaches you your place, not with cruelty, but with exclusion. I wasn't the bride, not anymore. I wasn't even a guest. The night before what was supposed to be my wedding felt like standing at the edge of something that no longer wanted me. It was too quiet to be peaceful, too still to be comforting. The kind of silence that doesn't cradle, it isolates. I had never felt so removed from the world I had once believed belonged to me. All week, I had been collecting shadows. Small, silent confirmations of something dark moving just beneath the surface. Disappearing invitations, sudden venue changes, photos that excluded me, messages left unanswered. But that night, the shadows didn't just surround me, they consumed everything. I sat in my apartment with the lights off, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. The dress was still in its garment bag, hanging on the closet door like a question I was too afraid to answer. My shoes were lined neatly beneath it, untouched. They looked absurd now, elegant and silver, made for someone who still had a place to arrive. There was no ceremony to attend. Not for me. But something was happening. I could feel it in the air, heavy and electric, like the tension before a storm breaks open. I checked my phone again, not expecting anything but still hoping. The screen was blank. No messages, no missed calls, no explanations. Just silence. By midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. My body wouldn't rest. My mind wouldn't stop. So I got in my car and drove, unsure of where I was going until I found myself heading toward the church. The city was nearly empty. Streetlights flickered past in a rhythmic blur, casting long shadows across the pavement. It felt like the world had gone to sleep without me, left me awake in a dream that no longer made sense. When I reached the hilltop where the church stood, everything was dark except for a single light above the entrance. It spilled golden and soft onto the stone steps, highlighting the floral garlands now wrapped around the banisters. The decorations were already in place. White roses, eucalyptus, soft strands of fabric cascading gently down the railings. Everything looked finished, prepared, ready. I parked a short distance away and stayed in the car, staring at the building. My chest ached with a weight that had no name. This was supposed to be my place, my day, my story. Instead, I was outside looking in. No one saw me, no one came out. There were no voices, no laughter, no music. But the stillness told its own story. Someone had been here recently. Someone had left everything just so. I remembered the first time Daniel and I visited the church together. How he had held my hand as we walked down the center aisle, both of us laughing at how strange it felt to imagine ourselves at the altar. How we had lingered in the side garden afterward, talking about our future like it was something permanent. That version of us felt so distant now, like a photograph left in the sun too long. Edges faded, colors washed out. I sat in that car until the cold crept in through the seams of the windows, until my hands began to tremble from something deeper than temperature. Then I turned the key and drove home, slower this time. I didn't want to go back, but I had nowhere else to be. When I walked inside, the apartment felt foreign. The walls, once warm and familiar, seemed hollow. The framed engagement photos on the console table blurred as I passed, my eyes refusing to hold on to them. I poured a glass of water I didn't drink and stood at the kitchen counter for what felt like hours, trying to gather the courage to admit that everything was already over. It didn't happen with a single moment. It wasn't one fight, one betrayal, one lie. It was the accumulation of small abandonments, the way no one had checked on me all week, the way plans had been made without my voice, the way Daniel had vanished without truly leaving. And still, the smallest part of me resisted. Still, I wanted someone to call and say it had all been a mistake, that the photos were misleading, that the date had never changed, that the dress was still mine. But that call never came. Around 3 a.m., I opened the closet and pulled out the dress. I unzipped the garment bag slowly, my hands shaking not from anticipation, but from grief. I lifted the fabric and draped it over my arm, carrying it into the living room where I could see it in full light. It was beautiful. Soft ivory, not quite white, with delicate lace tracing the neckline. The hem shimmered slightly with every movement, and the back fell into a gentle train meant to follow me down an aisle that would never be mine. I laid it across the couch and sat beside it, my fingers tracing the seams. Every stitch felt like a memory, every detail, a choice I had made with love. And yet none of it belonged to me anymore. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe until the first pale light of morning touched the curtains. Maybe until the sky turned from navy to gray. All I know is that by the time the sun rose, I wasn't the same person who had laid the dress out. Something had unraveled inside me. Something quiet but permanent. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, letting the silence tell me what no one else had the courage to say. I was no longer the bride, and tomorrow, someone else would stand in my place, wearing my dress, holding my bouquet, smiling in my mother's embrace, and I would be nowhere, forgotten, but not broken. Not yet. I woke up on what should have been my wedding day without an alarm, without anticipation, and without purpose. The light pouring through the curtains felt wrong, too soft, too golden, like the morning was mocking me. In another life, I'd be surrounded by friends and family, hair in curls, makeup half finished, holding hands with someone who whispered that today was going to be perfect. Instead, I sat alone on the edge of my bed, staring at the garment bag hanging from the closet. It hadn't moved since the night before. The dress still lay there, untouched, now more symbolic than wearable. I didn't open it. I couldn't. My phone remained silent. No texts, no updates, no last-minute confirmations. The absence was complete. total, inescapable. There was still a part of me that needed to see it through, not because I believed it would somehow all be reversed, not because I hoped someone would stop it, but because I needed to witness it. I needed to see with my own eyes what everyone else had been too cowardly to admit out loud. I showered slowly, dressed simply, tied my hair back like it was any other day. I didn't wear makeup. I didn't bring anything with me. No gifts, no camera, no backup plan. Just my keys, my silence, and the gnawing ache of truth sitting heavy in my chest. The drive to the church was longer than I remembered. Each red light lingered. Each turn felt sharper. I watched people out on sidewalks sipping coffee, pushing strollers, walking dogs, living lives that made sense. Ordinary Saturday mornings unfolding as they should. Mine was folding in on itself. When I reached the top of the hill, the scene before me didn't surprise me. It confirmed everything. Cars packed the lot, parked at angles across the grass. Ribbons hung from the church railings. Music floated faintly through the air, muffled by thick wooden doors. The ceremony was already in motion. I pulled into a side street and parked at a distance, far enough not to be seen, close enough to observe. My hands rested motionless on the steering wheel. For several minutes, I just sat there, unwilling to step into the finality of what was happening. But I did. Slowly. Carefully. I approached the church, each step quiet, deliberate. The sidewalk beneath my feet felt foreign, like I was trespassing on sacred ground. I paused at the corner where the path opened to the entrance and stayed in the shadows. The doors were cracked open just wide enough to see the inside. Candles flickered down the aisle. Flower petals lined the runner. Guests sat in neat rows, heads turned toward the altar. The photographer knelt near the front, snapping pictures of a moment that wasn't mine. And then I saw her, Emily, walking down the aisle in my dress. The dress I had chosen, fitted, paid for. It clung to her frame like it had always belonged to her. Her veil floated behind her, catching the light like spun sugar. She smiled at the guests, holding the bouquet I had built from memory and meaning. Beside her stood our mother, her hand resting lightly on Emily's back, beaming as if everything was exactly as it should be. And Daniel stood waiting at the altar, calm, poised, hands clasped, not nervous, not confused, just ready, not for me, for her. There was no stutter in his movements, no glance over his shoulder, no hesitation. No one turned to look for me. No one noticed I wasn't among the crowd. No one wondered where the actual bride had gone, because, as far as they were concerned, she was already there. I stepped back slowly, away from the view, away from the noise, away from the truth that had taken solid form. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a scheduling error. It wasn't miscommunication. They had replaced me. Carefully. Deliberately. Silently. And everyone had played their part. I walked down the hill, feet steady, movements light. The sun was warm, birds chirping in nearby trees. The world, indifferent to the collapse of mine. I got back in my car and closed the door. The sound was louder than I expected. Final. I stared through the windshield, hands resting in my lap. It would have been easier to fall apart, to scream, to throw something, to demand answers from people who would never give them. But I didn't. Because the silence was louder than rage. Because the silence was what they had chosen. And now, it was mine. I sat in that parked car for what felt like hours, letting the moment pass without me. Letting their wedding continue, each vow a nail in the coffin of the life I thought I was building. I didn't need to hear what they said. I didn't need to watch them kiss or cut the cake or dance in circles under fairy lights. I had already lived through the worst part, the part where I realized I had been forgotten by the people who claimed to love me. When I finally started the engine, I didn't look back. I drove home in silence, the dress still hanging untouched in the apartment. the invitation still stacked in the drawer, the seating chart still pinned to the corkboard above my desk. All of it now obsolete. Artifacts of a story that had never truly belonged to me. When I walked through my door, I sat on the floor, knees pulled to my chest, and closed my eyes. The ceremony would be ending soon. Guests would be clapping. Photos would be taken. Cake would be cut. And not one person would notice the absence of the woman who was supposed to be the bride. That was the truth I carried. Not because it broke me, but because it freed me. The worst had already happened, and I was still here. The day after the wedding felt colder than it should have. Even with the sun high in the sky, everything around me carried a strange stillness. The world had kept spinning, indifferent to the quiet disaster I had just endured. It was as though nothing had changed, but I had. I didn't turn on my phone that morning. I wasn't ready to see photos of Emily in my dress or captions filled with words like magical and blessed. I wasn't ready to read the kind of shallow celebration that floats across timelines, proof of joy that doesn't account for the destruction behind it. I made tea I didn't drink and stood barefoot in my kitchen for an hour before I could convince myself to sit down. The apartment felt different now. It wasn't just a home anymore, it was a witness. Every corner reminded me of what I had prepared for. The framed save the dates still sat on the entry table. The small champagne flutes lined up in a row on the counter. The list of vows I had written and rewritten tucked inside a notebook in the second drawer of my desk. Evidence. That's what it had become. Not of a celebration, but of a heist. By mid-afternoon, the silence became unbearable. Not because it was empty, but because I knew the silence from them would not end in apology or remorse. It would be filled instead with excuses, rationalizations, lies spun into justifications, or worse, pretending it hadn't been wrong at all. So I opened my laptop and started documenting everything. It began with dates, the first signs, the slow shift in tone. I wrote about the meetings I hadn't been included in, the decisions made without me, the messages left unanswered, the fitting I hadn't attended but saw photos of anyway. I included screenshots, forwarded emails, calendar appointments I had never accepted. I didn't know exactly what I was building. I only knew that if I didn't give this betrayal shape, it would devour me in abstract. By evening, I had nearly 50 pages of notes, timelines, observations, names, moments where I had stayed silent when I should have spoken, moments where I had convinced myself it was all in my head. I saw now how methodical it had been, how they had stripped me of everything slowly enough that I would question my own instincts. But now, there was nothing left to question. The next morning, I called a lawyer. I didn't want revenge. I didn't even know if anything they had done was legally punishable. But I needed clarity. I needed someone outside of the emotional wreckage to tell me what was real. I brought everything with me: notes, receipts, printed messages, photos. The office was quiet, neutral. I sat across from a woman who read everything without expression, flipping through page after page with a kind of detached efficiency that made me feel strangely comforted. She didn't gasp. She didn't ask why I hadn't stopped it. She just kept reading. When she finished, she looked at me like someone assessing damage after a fire. What she said next wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the verdict I had hoped for, but it was the one I needed. I had rights, financial ones. The venue had been paid for in my name, the dress, the floral contracts, the catering deposits, my credit card, my signature, my planning. What they had done might not qualify as criminal fraud, but it could absolutely be challenged as a misappropriation of services and identity. And more than anything, I had a case for emotional harm, especially if the evidence proved deliberate exclusion. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be fast. but it could be done. The weight of that truth settled deep in my chest. I didn't have to let it go. I didn't have to pretend it didn't matter. There was a path, not to vengeance, but to accountability. I left her office feeling more in control than I had in months. Not whole, not healed, but grounded. That week, I began the process of issuing letters of dispute. I contacted the vendors, requesting official statements about who had made changes, who had attended fittings, who had redirected communications. Some were cooperative, others were cautious, but patterns emerged. My name had been on every contract, my email on every account, until slowly it wasn't. Until another name, Emily's, began appearing. Until decisions were approved by the family. Until I had been erased in quiet administrative steps that no one thought to question. I filed formal complaints with a few of the businesses. I didn't expect refunds. I wanted records. I wanted proof. I wanted the map of my erasure in ink and timestamps. Still, the emotional weight pressed heavier than any legal document could account for. Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake replaying everything, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when Daniel stopped loving me, if he ever did. Trying to understand why my mother never intervened. Trying to believe that my sister, who had once held my hand when I was afraid of thunderstorms, had truly taken everything with no remorse. The grief came in waves. Sometimes I couldn't breathe. Other times I felt nothing at all. One evening, I stood in the shower for over an hour, letting the water scald my skin as if it could peel the betrayal from my body. I wrapped myself in towels and sat on the floor afterward, shivering despite the heat. But with each passing day, the fog began to lift, just a little. I stopped checking their profiles. I stopped rereading the messages. I stopped expecting someone to come knocking on my door, full of regret. No one did. The world, as expected, had moved on. There were honeymoon photos, toasts from relatives. My mother's voice echoed in videos, laughing, clapping, proud. They had made their choice, and now I was making mine. I would no longer fight to belong where I wasn't wanted. I would no longer beg to be remembered. I would no longer carry the shame that didn't belong to me. They had stolen a wedding, but they hadn't stolen my voice. That was mine. And now, I was ready to use it. I woke up that morning to a silence so complete, it almost felt unnatural. No buzzing texts, no emails from my mother trying to smooth things over, no sudden knocks on my door. For the first time in months, the absence of noise didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like permission. Permission to begin again, without anyone's interference. Permission to decide who I was, outside of the shame and manipulation that had defined the last year of my life. The air in the lake house was still, cool, and crisp with early autumn, carrying a faint scent of pine and distant water. I made coffee, not because I needed the caffeine, but because the ritual of pouring, stirring, and sipping felt like a small act of self-loyalty. My hands were steady. That alone felt like progress. It had been weeks since I said no to my family. Weeks since I turned down their request to use my home for a celebration I was never meant to be part of. In those weeks, the guilt faded slowly, like the last traces of perfume on a pillow. At first, it clung to me, whispering doubts. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe I should have been the bigger person. But with each passing day, I grew more certain that saying no had been the kindest thing I had ever done for myself. I had spent so many years bending to accommodate other people's comfort, especially my family's. Biting my tongue, laughing things off, allowing quiet exclusions to go unchallenged. But not anymore. There's something radical about realizing you don't owe forgiveness to those who haven't earned it. That you can love someone and still walk away when they treat you like an afterthought. Therapy helped. Writing helped more. I started journaling again, not just about the betrayal, but about who I was before it all. I revisited childhood memories, not to romanticize them, but to remember the strength I had back then. The girl who stood up for her brother when he was bullied in high school. The teenager who worked 2 jobs to buy her own art supplies. The woman who built a career from scratch and bought a house most people only dream about. That girl never needed permission to take up space, and she certainly didn't need approval from people who had proven they could discard her. I redecorated the guest room Vanessa was meant to use. I repainted the walls a deep forest green, replaced the linens, and removed every trace of what that room had symbolized. It wasn't a space for compromise anymore. It was a sanctuary for me, a reading nook, a creative corner, a reminder that I could reclaim anything they tried to taint. There were moments, of course, when the sadness hit like a wave, when I saw an old photo or a memory popped into my mind uninvited. A family barbecue, a Christmas morning, Tyler laughing, our parents pretending the world was perfect. Those memories still hurt, but I stopped chasing them for comfort. I let them be what they were, relics of a version of my life that no longer existed. What surprised me most was how many people stepped forward once I began speaking the truth. Friends who had watched from the sidelines, unsure of how to approach me. Colleagues who confided their own stories of family betrayals. Strangers online who recognized themselves in my story. I had always feared that standing my ground would isolate me, but it did the opposite. It brought me closer to those who valued honesty over appearance, depth over convenience. Emma and Jasmine visited often. We started a monthly, no-drama dinner ritual. Wine, food, and laughter without judgment or expectations. These small gatherings reminded me that love could be safe, warm, and generous. That not every relationship had to be transactional or conditional. That true connection never required you to shrink yourself. Zoe, my business partner, had been gently encouraging me to lead a new project, a retreat space for women recovering from emotional betrayal. At first, I dismissed the idea. It felt too raw, too close. But as the weeks passed, the vision started taking shape. A space built not just for healing, but for reimagining what healing could look like. Workshops, creative spaces, quiet cabins with journals on every nightstand. A community born from truth. I realized I didn't want to just move on from what happened. I wanted to transform it, not into revenge, but into purpose. Because sometimes the greatest form of closure isn't confrontation or apology. It's evolution. It's becoming someone your past never thought you could be. I didn't block my family. I didn't erase them. I simply stopped giving them front row seats to my life. My mother's occasional messages were still met with silence. My father's guilt, when it appeared, no longer held power over me. And Tyler, he hadn't reached out since my refusal. That silence was its own answer. His absence hurt, but it also made things clear. Some relationships end without a fight. Just a quiet closing of the door. On the 1-year anniversary of what should have been my wedding day, I took myself on a solo trip. Just 2 hours north to a quiet cabin tucked into a hillside. I brought my journal, a bottle of wine, and a stack of books. No phones. No reminders of anyone else's expectations. That weekend, I wrote the final chapter of a story I never meant to live. I wrote about betrayal, yes, but more than that, I wrote about awakening, about how pain peels back the layers of who you thought you were and introduces you to the person you were always meant to become. When I returned, I placed that journal on the shelf beside my childhood photo albums. Not to hide it, but to honor it. To remind myself that the woman I had become had survived something unspeakable, and she had done it without losing her softness. Rebuilding didn't mean forgetting. It meant remembering differently. It meant looking at the scars and saying, "Here is where I learned. Here is where I stopped begging to be seen. Here is where I started. I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror at first, not because she had changed beyond recognition, but because she had grown into herself in ways I had never allowed before. Her eyes were steadier now, not hard, but no longer searching for proof of worth in other people's reflections. Her smile was smaller, but truer. She carried peace like a secret, quiet, firm, and entirely her own. It had been 13 months since the church doors shut in my face. 13 months since my mother stood there, veil in hand, and told me I was not the one getting married that day. Sometimes I still wondered what hurt more, the betrayal itself or the fact that it had been rehearsed so thoroughly that no one even flinched. But those questions didn't burn like they used to. They sat quietly now, like stones settled at the bottom of a lake. The ripples had stilled, and I had learned how to swim anyway. That morning, the lake house was humming with low sounds. Birdsong, the breeze combing through the trees, my coffee brewing on the stove. A new day, and this time, I didn't wake bracing for another emotional ambush. I had stopped expecting closure from the people who broke me. Instead, I built my own. My career had grown, slowly but purposefully. I'd taken on fewer clients but more meaningful projects, homes for people starting over, places that felt like forgiveness. I'd learned to say no to the energy that drained me, even when it came wrapped in familiar faces. The retreat center Zoe and I envisioned had gone from sketches to a real structure. It sat on a plot of land just 30 minutes from the lake house, tucked between tall pines and open sky. Women came from across the country to stay for weekends, sometimes weeks. They came hollowed out by betrayal, confused by the ache of being discarded by those who once claimed to love them. And they left a little fuller, not healed entirely, but no longer unraveling. They left with parts of themselves stitched back together with gentleness. I didn't tell my story at first. I let others share, held space for their pain. But over time, I realized that healing wasn't only in listening, it was in being witnessed. So I began to share, carefully, honestly, without embellishment. And in return, I was met not with pity, but recognition. Women saw themselves in my wounds, and I saw strength in theirs. I stopped counting the days since I'd last heard from my mother, or from Nathan, my ex-fiancé. I imagined they believed their silence was a punishment, but it was a gift, one I had finally stopped returning. Tyler reached out once, a vague apology wrapped in nostalgia. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. He had chosen the version of me that was quiet, compliant, always available to be used and then dismissed. That version no longer existed. Instead, I poured my love into the life I was building, into new traditions, into friendships that didn't flinch when I was messy or exhausted or unapologetically firm. I hosted Sunday suppers on the deck. I hiked unfamiliar trails alone, finding comfort in my own company. I created space for joy that wasn't contingent on anyone else showing up. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, I found the wedding planner I had kept during my engagement to Nathan. It was still filled with scribbles, fabric samples, notes about venues I would never walk through. For a moment, I stared at it, wondering if I should toss it out. But then I placed it back on the shelf, not to remember what never happened, but to honor who I was when I believed in it. That version of me wasn't naive. She was hopeful, and hope is not a weakness. It is a beautiful place to begin again. My lake house had become more than a home. It was a line in the sand, a promise I made to myself and kept, even when it would have been easier to break. Every beam, every brushstroke of paint, every flower in the garden was a sentence in a story I wrote by choosing myself, not out of spite, but out of love. Healing didn't make me immune to sadness, Grief still passed through me in waves, soft and sharp. There were days I missed the illusion of family, the old Sunday dinners, the birthday traditions. But I had learned to tell the difference between what I missed and what had harmed me. Sometimes we grieve the idea of people more than their reality. And that's okay. It means we're human. It means we once believed in something beautiful. The biggest shift came not from forgiveness, but from redefinition. I stopped asking why they did it. I stopped needing them to explain. I stopped offering them the vocabulary for my pain. They didn't deserve that intimacy. Not anymore. Instead, I asked better questions. Who am I now? What does love look like without performance? What kind of woman do I want to become in the aftermath? I became a woman who plants her own garden, not because no one else brought her flowers, but because she wanted something rooted. I became a woman who sets the table for chosen family and who never begs anyone to take a seat. I became someone who understands that boundaries aren't walls, they're bridges to self-respect. One cool evening, as the sun began to dip behind the trees, I stood at the edge of the lake and watched the sky bloom in amber and rose. The same view I once stared into through tears now held something else: peace. The kind of peace that doesn't come from forgetting, but from remembering differently. In the distance, laughter echoed. Emma and Jasmine were inside preparing dinner, their voices rising with joy. Zoe would arrive soon. My deck was strung with soft lights. My home smelled like rosemary and hope. The night was quiet and full, and for the first time in years, I no longer carried the weight of waiting to be included, chosen, validated. I was already whole, already home. So if this story resonated with you, if you've ever stood at a metaphorical door and been told you weren't welcome, if you've ever had to choose yourself over family, over love, over the illusion of belonging, I want you to know this: you are not alone. You are not wrong for walking away. You are not cruel for demanding more. You deserve to be loved out loud. You deserve a seat at the table you helped build. You deserve a life where you don't have to beg to be seen. And if that means starting over, rebuilding from ashes, claiming a future no one else could envision for you, do it. Do it with trembling hands if you must. Do it anyway. And when you stand at the edge of that new life, breathing in the air of your own becoming, know that you did something brave. You chose you. Thank you for listening to my story. If this journey spoke to your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need a little courage today. You are not alone, and you are worth everything they tried to make you forget.